Hey everyone, welcome to this demo session with Eclipseium. Joining us from Eclipseium is John Loucaides, the VP of Research and Development. John, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Nice to have you. We're going to try and stick to 30 minutes. Anytime we get John and I on the lines, we get nerdy real fast. So we're going to try and focus on
It's
this
true.
on the demo, right? And
It's true.
it's very timely, given recent news. We covered it last week, actually, on Pulse Security Weekly, where there were a module, I should say, in Trickbot, essentially that was probing the UEFI subsystem. If I captured that correctly, John, that'll be some of the discussion today in our demo, as well as seeing how the Eclipseium product works to help you as an enterprise and business to secure the firmware in your systems, which is yet another thing you have to patch, essentially.
Oh yeah. It's been a long time coming. We could see a lot of these things as they were ramping up. First of all, through attacks on network devices, looking at various campaigns against Cisco, against VPN concentrators, against Pulse, against Citrix, and we also saw it against UEFI over the years. We started with Hacking Team and some of the different disclosures. LoJax, Mosaic Regressor. Now we're seeing Trickbot, and it's sort of a different, it's sort of a milestone. It shows a different set of actors now moving down deeper into the stack. And this is kind of exactly what I was predicting a long time ago, right? A lot of us were really just waiting for the day when somebody would get down there because it was inevitable. It's something that gives you a lot of privilege, and it's not that hard. It's just obscure.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I agree. When you think of a group like Hacking Team, they're like pen testers, hackers for hire, except without that morals kind of values is kind of what the group that I would put Hacking Team in. Yeah, and you would expect that groups like that were maybe acting on behalf of nation states or other nefarious means, that they would go after some of these tactics and techniques within firmware. Also, nation state actors outside of that, right? Hacking Team was kind of the Swiss Army knife, if you will. That's like a whole other podcast we could do on just that, right? But now we've seen it basically baked into common everyday malware. I mean, Trickbot's pretty common, average everyday malware. I think we likened it to kind of a Swiss Army knife in and of itself, similar to like back orifice and other types of malware. And now we're seeing that type of malware and threat actors go after this attack vector.
Exactly. And it's a framework. And if you look at how all of each of those different adversaries started using firmware in the beginning, the very first thing everyone does is to try and copy and paste a bunch of code that's already available. Things that researchers did a long time ago, things that nation states were doing probably years and years ago. And you're now in a position where there's plenty of code out there to be copied. Hacking Team did it. And now you're seeing with LoJax, or sorry, you're seeing this copied from Hacking Team in Mosaic Regressor. And now you're seeing this with Trickbot copying other open source projects that are different than the previous ones because there are just so many at this point.
And we're about a month out or so from when Microsoft worked with federal agencies to attempt to take down Trickbot, only to have it resurface, essentially.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting problem because a lot of these botnets actually tend to do this sort of resiliency aspect to what they're doing. Unless you actually go and round up all of the people who are involved in it, it's going to be something that they know the techniques. That turns out the techniques do work. And it does make sense why you would now be going after a persistence mechanism, because you have a advanced adversary who's going to take down your botnet. And so now I'm going to use a more advanced technique. And so
we have no evidence of that. I mean, we could find one of the actors behind Trickbot and interview them and ask them, like, hey, did you put this module in, right, as a direct response to that? I think there is, would likely be, that's exactly why we wanted to put this module in. I mean, it would make sense. We have no evidence of that, but that's why we like doing podcast type things, because we get to express our opinions.
And we got all sorts of different ideas too. I mean, if you could be doing this for persistence, But you could also be doing this for disruption. We've
Yes.
seen other adversaries use these same techniques to brick systems.
Hmm.
If you were to do that sort of thing and you were Trickbot, right, you're talking tens of thousands of different
Right.
systems, a lot of which are going to be vulnerable to this issue. If you wanted to bring stuff down, that would be horrible, right? And
Yes.
it'd be very difficult to recover. So that's the
Yes.
difference with this sort of area where your recovery techniques, your the power that the adversary has is different than what you're usually dealing with. So the
Yep.
techniques don't necessarily work. Right? You're not going to just wipe and reinstall. You're going to have to actually mess with the motherboard.
Yep. Yeah. I think of the Olympics. It was
Oh
Korea
yeah.
in the Olympics, and they were wiping and rebuilding systems. And I forget what the reinfection vector was. They figured it out eventually. But if you wanted to disrupt something like that, this would
Hmm.
be an attack vector you would likely want to have in your arsenal.
Exactly. And I think the difference between 10, 20 years ago when nation states were doing this or capable of
Hmm.
doing this and today is just which adversaries. Now
Yeah.
you're getting to the point where it can be almost any of the adversaries that you could possibly want. Anyone who can copy code can do this now. And you're
Yep.
using the same vulnerability that people in 2010 were writing specs about how to secure the spy flash
Hmm.
interface, and you're now seeing a malware that is extremely common, also extremely resilient, but extremely common actually using this kind of an attack. So maybe 20 years ago, kind of special, but now it's kind of mainstream, I guess.
Right. And so, what do we do about it, John? You got a demo
So
prepared for us, which is awesome. Yeah.
yeah, so I'm going to show you a little bit about what we can do about it. The first thing to remember is that these things are just obscure. They're not different. They're not like
Mhm.
unstoppable threats. They're just computers and how they work, right? So what I'm going to show you is the same sort of thing that you would do if it was at an OS or an application or a network layer. It's just in a different layer that these normal tools and techniques don't cover. And so you're
Mhm.
going to start with visibility, and you're going to get into what you can do to protect these interfaces, what you're going to do to be able to discover and detect tampering, and you're going to be able to actually apply this across different stages in the life cycle. So real
My
quick, I'll start
my
sharing.
whole thing is pay attention because you don't want Trickbot to be the software that's telling you about vulnerabilities in your UEFI systems or other firmware. You want Eclipseium to tell you that and address it beforehand before you have something like a Trickbot that's messing with your firmware.
That is the thing, exactly. I think if you are ahead of the game, you can actually be sure that there will be an easier target, right? Somebody who's not
Yeah.
paying attention, random consumer grade equipment that just, does whatever it does. But in an enterprise, it's particularly with the most critical devices in the enterprise, you don't want the adversary to be the one scanning your network for this. You'd
Right.
really like to be the first one to know, right?
It's not just
So
scanning for the presence of UEFI. Trickbot was scanning for the presence of a vulnerability that could be exploited to do
exactly,
nefarious things with your firmware. And what Eclipseium allows you to do is do that before the evil attackers are scanning for vulnerability. They're not going to find any because you're going to find them first and fix them. And that's why you need a
exactly.
tool like this. And there's all kinds of other use cases. I mean, John and I have gone through dozens of them probably in our interviews as to why this is important. I think before we were talking about how Microsoft does a really good job preserving the integrity of software updates. Not every firmware manufacturer does, and that's some of the things Eclipseium can tell you is not just which firmware you have, where you should upgrade to, but about the integrity of what you have and what you're going to install.
That's right. So imagine yourself in the situation that you have an enterprise and you want to know what's vulnerable. What Eclipseium is going to let you see, first of all, at a high level, the number of devices that are vulnerable
Mhm.
to various high risk attacks. But let's go look at TrickBot specifically. We
Mhm.
capture the vulnerability that they're doing reconnaissance for as missing BIOS write protections. And so
Mhm.
here's the list of systems that are going to show up if TrickBot scans your network. This is exactly what they would see as vulnerable. And you can kind of dive into one of these and you can see. that it's vulnerable to missing BIOS write protections, but it's also vulnerable to a bunch of other stuff, which is
Hmm.
normal because these things add up. And if you're not keeping up with the BIOS updates, you probably have a bunch of CVEs. We'll
Yeah, and
actually
we talk
point
about that
you.
in vulnerability management for any vector is that debt that you can get yourself into. The further you're behind on software updates and patching, the more debt that you have, and the more, in my opinion, not some there's security risk there, but there's also a lot of operational risk the further you get behind because getting to that stable, secure state is now a lot more work and carries with it a lot more operational risk.
Absolutely. If you're just using your own personal computer and you're just updating to whatever's the latest, that's fine. But if you're going to deploy this across a large enterprise and you have a 1% failure rate, 1% could
Hmm.
be really bad for you.
Yes.
And that'll be a bad day for the ops team, right? So what you
Hmm.
want to do is manage these things, and that's what Eclipseium is really all about. It's not just about going and throwing code around. It's about understanding what that code means and showing you what the actual risks are and what the actual integrity is going to look like down at the component level. And so we'll break up every device into a bunch of different components and we'll apply this risk and integrity to each component individually. So
And that's
that's
because
what we're about.
you cross multiple vendors because inside of your systems you've got firmware components that come from multiple vendors that all have their different management interfaces. And so yeah, you could do this on one system and go get all those utilities and make sure everything's updated, but when you're going to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, that you need a tool like this that's cross platform,
Oh, yes, that's
for lack
right.
of a better term, cross platform.
Actually, a fun little tidbit here is you can see sometimes when vulnerabilities are fixed, but sometimes it's not called out with a CVE. Like here in this
Hmm.
case, this update is fixing some security fix, but what security fix is it? They didn't tell you. They didn't tell you the CVE, and they didn't tell you anything about it. But you probably want to install this to fix some security issue. That
Hmm.
is very common across the industry. And that's the sort of thing where actually doing a check on the device specific level and seeing which vulnerabilities we have detected outside of whatever the manufacturer's change log happens to say is really valuable. And in particular valuable when you have some kind of reconnaissance operation like what Trickbot was doing.
Hmm. Is that because you're looking inside the firmware to determine if it's vulnerable to certain things outside of what the vendor might tell you that, hey, there's a security fix? You're like auto reverse engineering the firmware essentially to
That
figure
is
that
a
out.
great question. Yeah, no, that's a really important thing to understand about the way Eclipseium works. We don't just do one thing. We actually do a lot of different data collection across a
Hmm.
lot of different sources, and we do analytic techniques that create kind of a profile. And you start to find deviations from that profile. Some of them are deviations you know a lot about, vulnerabilities, like this
Hmm.
particular vulnerability is evidenced by certain register settings, but also just configuration. So we can sort of see that secure boot is enabled on this system, that it's using an IOMMU to confine DMA. You
Hmm.
can see that the behaviors of the system are such that they aren't really trying to hide the firmware. In terms of what can be done, you're trying to discover the normal operation, the normal profile of one of these specific machines, and you're doing that through a lot of different data gathering. So,
Hmm.
back to your question about how we do it. Yes, we are looking at the firmware image and we're capturing it. And that's better shown on this machine, which is a demo laptop where we implanted it ourselves with one of these open source. You can find it on GitHub type back doors. And you can see that we detect it not only through indicators of compromise, but also because we are looking at the binary itself and we find that the integrity of the individual binaries is failing on exactly one out of 523. So, first of all, think about the attack surface here. You've got
Hmm.
523 executables that are running potentially before the OS starts, doing all sorts of things from network stacks to configuring each and every component device. But now one of those is not what came from, in this case, it's a Dell laptop. So Dell did not create this one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that we added as an implant. But in addition to that, we're also seeing our static analysis, which is what you're thinking about, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
This is where we are finding a profile for the kind of code that is inside the firmware, and we look at, what does normal firmware do? Well, it sets a bunch of registers, it configures a device, it configures it a certain way. What it usually does not do is go messing around with the runtime operating system, because
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of weird. But
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly what a lot of these malicious implants would actually be doing. And that's what's failing here. You're seeing that it tampers with the operating system environment. And so you can
That's really
find
cool.
that one specific module and call it out. And you could kind of go create a history of these things and see, across many different systems, across many different scans, what the normal profile looks like and what the current profile looks like. And that is how we discover what an integrity failure is. And we can
Gotcha.
see that even if we've never seen this particular malware before.
I love that. I love systems like this that are analyzing the software on top of what is generally being reported as a vulnerability. We see this in the
Yeah.
regular software world as well. And they're some of my favorite techniques because the attack surface goes so much far beyond CVE. Put it that way.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, that's the thing. I really don't think that it's enough, personally. My view on a lot of this is you create single points of failure by relying on one mechanism, one process, one technology, and that's not really helping you very much. It's better
Hmm.
than nothing, sure, but we don't have to work that way. And so what we've done is we tried to pull in multiple different sources, and we tried to put that scan, that output, in a way that is easy to insert into multiple different business processes. If you think
Hmm.
about it from IR, you're going to read this dashboard right to left, and you're going to start right up here in the corner, and you're going to say, yep, this is known bad. There are specific indicators of compromise. Yeah, this is the sort of thing a lot of virus scanners have been doing since the beginning. But if I'm failing that, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's bad. If I'm going next, this is where I'm going to discover something out of the ordinary that does actually have fit the profile of something that could be bad, that could be
Hmm.
malicious. That's an integrity failure. And that doesn't need a signature. That doesn't need indicators of compromise. That's a deviation from the profile in a way that is actually very risky. It's looking
Right.
like
It's
it's
a
an actual attack.
potential attack. Yeah. Attack path, I should say.
Attack path, exactly.
Hmm.
And
And
then
so
kind
we should, you do need to have an agent on your systems to collect this level of telemetry.
Yes. So to get down to this level, you do. What we've
Hmm.
started to do, though, is to start looking at, when you had all of these VPN and network device attacks, we started introducing remote scans into our product. And you were able to
Hmm.
see by either logging into your Cisco and pulling back information, or even just fingerprinting what's around your device. And if you can get enough of a good fingerprint to find a version number, you can
Hmm.
start to find which some of those top 10 vulnerabilities that are being exploited in network equipment. You can actually find those things that are vulnerable
Hmm.
just remotely. So what we're doing is we're kind of augmenting the profile that I was talking about with the profile of everything that's around you. So it's not
Hmm.
just inherent to your device, which is where we sort of specialize, but we're also including what's around you, what you're using to communicate. And
Hmm.
if you think about what's happened this year with COVID and people working from home or working from different locations than what you would normally expect in the office, that's become really important. So that's kind of the driving force behind why we tried to do this year in particular.
Mm. That's interesting. So does your installed agent look around itself for other devices?
That's the idea. That's the
Oh,
idea.
that's
So if you
interesting.
if you if you're communicating with your home router, and your home router happens to be this one that's very commonly part of a botnet, it has certain
Hmm.
vulnerabilities, we can start detecting that. If you're using one of these VPN concentrators that has been the target of recent attacks, we can identify that. And this is all part of the idea that you're going to feed the information from this dashboard into a bunch of different processes. I talked about incident response over here. But now we can start talking about risk management in the middle. And
Hmm.
that's, you know, IR is going to be something that's very immediate. This risk management is going to have maybe a 30-day or 60-day window during which you're going to sort of reassess and reprioritize and make some changes. And this is where looking at those particular firmware vulnerabilities, particularly the high risk ones that are being targeted by these adversaries, but also just general patch management. This is where it all comes together. And you can
Hmm.
map that into compliance requirements. We've chosen to really push that into a lot of the NIST controls.
Hmm.
NIST has actually been on this for a while. Props to them because they actually, for 10 years have really been publishing about, how firmware security is important, and we can map directly into some of their existing publications. You just take
Hmm.
a look at these vulnerabilities and you sort of say, here's what NIST says needs to be done. If you kind of take another step back, all of this is really just a big database of an inventory of what you have at the component level of every device. And you might think of an asset inventory as, all of the different laptops and servers that you have and where they are. This is that lower level of the asset, which is all the components inside it. And so when you get something new, you want to go query to see what is available or what is part of your infrastructure that might be impacted by some new piece of information, whether that's maybe that's a vulnerability, but maybe that's actually just an operational problem where there's a certain firmware image or a certain component. If you have it, it's going to break when such and such happens, and I want to go find each one of those. And so that's this ultimately the database upon which we've done an analytics to find these other things.
So, in the case of the Trickbot vulnerability that you've discovered in this example, you would take that information and you would have some more intelligence around it before you sent it off to the central patch management system, which would be responsible for then pushing the patch out so that vulnerability no longer exists in your environment.
Exactly. So right now, if you were managing an infrastructure, we identify what they're doing recon for as
Hmm.
missing BIOS write protections. You can go read about in the blog what that actually means, but it basically is saying that you can rewrite firmware, and any
Right.
software can do that. And if you have this vulnerability, these are the systems you're going to want to go patch. These are the systems that you're going to want to go address that on. And in particular, this is an example of one of those systems where you can find the specific update that you might want to be deploying right about now.
Hmm.
Then can download it, can put it into your system management process, and get it deployed to this specific machine with this specific profile and address this specific vulnerability.
And that may be multiple different firmware updates for the different collections of systems, right? Maybe you've rolled out 10,000 laptops
Absolutely.
and there's a certain percentage of
Absolutely.
that population, but then you went and bought another 10,000 different laptops and they have the same vulnerability, but it's different firmware, maybe different hardware, which probably means different firmware inside of it that has that
Yeah.
same vulnerability. And now you need to go patch those as well. So you help like differentiate between the two and map out your
Here
plan
was
for
my
fixing it.
here was my ThinkPad, Lenovo, and here was my Dell Latitude, and
Hmm.
both of them are out of date. Both of them are fixing a bunch of things, and I can go and grab the specific latest version for each of these, put them all together into the deployment packages, and send each one to the appropriate system because you're actually keeping track at this level.
Right. And likely larger enterprises send that to a small percentage of folks, make sure it works. Maybe they have a test system, right? I want to make sure my firmware update works, especially everyone working from home. If I go,
Oh yeah,
we all know messing with firmware, you can end up breaking systems. I mean, I've bricked a lot of systems in my day messing around
yeah.
with stuff, right? And so this operationally deserves to be called out in that light that you definitely want to test these updates because when people are working from home, they're not all in the same corporate workspace where you can physically go address those issues. Now they're working from home and they're all over the country, over the world, and that's problematic.
So Eclipseium published some best practices for firmware
Hmm.
updates of a large enterprise. We actually did a survey of a bunch of different large organizations. We looked at what other folks had published. I think it would be worth taking a look for anyone who's looking to do this. You're exactly right, Paul. You do not want to just go and throw firmware around. You want to know exactly what you're trying to accomplish, and you want to take the risk of deployment exactly where that risk makes sense, right? In this
Hmm.
case, you know you're being targeted by maybe Trickbot. You know that Trickbot has this module to go scan for this particular vulnerability. Let's go find these firmware updates for these vulnerable systems and let's update those. And you might have other cases where you want to do this, but you want to do it in a controlled fashion. You want to
Hmm.
know the profile before and after. That's kind of what a visibility solution like Eclipseium is really doing. It's giving you that information that lets you make decisions. By the way, where we're headed is to make that even easier, where you're going to get even more information and you're going to be able to do these things in a more automated way. But this is the path that we're on, is really paving a road for people to be able to handle firmware risks the way that they've been handling other software.
Yeah, and it throws into that mix of vulnerability prioritization, which, as we've actually proven, if you've been listening to the show for the past few weeks, especially, we've talked about just how subjective it is to
Oh
determine
yeah,
the priority of remediating some type of risk in your environment. I mean, we've talked at length about how subjective that process is, and we didn't
yeah.
even start talking about how do you prioritize firmware in that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important to know the impact, and it's important to
Hmm.
know a lot of information about what your environment looks like and what this issue looks like. And that's the identification step, right? You want to
Hmm.
know what you want to have the information at your disposal quickly. And then you can take the actions to go do protection mechanisms. You can take the action again later to do a fail-safe of monitoring, which is what this integrity is all about, where
Hmm.
you might have residual risk. In fact, you're definitely going to have residual risk no matter
Hmm.
what you tried to protect. And you have to have sort of a backup in place. That's what this integrity check is all about. You'll be able to detect a compromise if it does happen, no matter what, how up to date you might be. And that's where you
Right,
can get
right.
into the respond, and that's where
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
actually include this in incident response as well. So you got all these different processes just queuing off of the same data that you're collecting in one place here.
And so good hygiene is not just making sure all of your firmware is up to date. The other critical component to hygiene is understanding what's happening inside of my firmware on all of my systems and when that might change to present a security risk.
Exactly. And so I think that that whole hygiene component to what we're doing is trying to really make your process work. And it's not just one process, it's all of the processes that need to have augmented firmware layer of what they're trying to accomplish. So you're going to have
Hmm.
a team that's doing acquisitions. They should be thinking about what the firmware updates for what they're buying are going to look like. They should be thinking about what the record is for that vendor, that supplier, and vulnerabilities, right? They should also be, now you're going to transition into operations, and they should be thinking about what the process is to manage these updates and to deploy these updates and which things should be prioritized. You get to move on into incident response or some sort of an issue that you're trying to remediate. Again, you want to see that it actually worked by looking at that profile. And if you have had a compromise, you want to see that they didn't bury themselves deep into firmware before you go putting
Hmm.
that back on the network.
Right. And this is just not a Windows problem. It extends out to Mac OS and
Not at
Linux
all.
as well, correct? It's
Absolutely.
really independent of operating system, which is kind of scary
And
to
that's
think
the
about.
fun part. In fact, you can
Mm.
have the same issue materialize on each of those different operating systems.
Hmm.
And one of the problems with looking at just version numbers or security advisories is that you won't see those things as the same. And in some cases, there might not have been a security advisory for Windows, right? I've seen
Yeah.
it happen where, Red Hat published something, same issue is actually in firmware on every operating system, but you don't have the corresponding Windows update for it because it doesn't make sense for Windows to handle it. It's
Right.
actually more of an OEM thing, you know?
And that's why you need Eclipseium and to pay attention as they're screen will come up next where you can get more information from within our platform for a virtual conference. So make sure you go do that. And John, you mentioned several great resources on the website. I encourage people to check those out as well at eclipseium.com.
Absolutely. Come send us email at info@eclipseium.com anytime. And if you hit us up before the holidays, there'll be something special in store.
Fantastic. John, thank you so much.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.